Good evening, everyone. I hope you had a nice day and before that, a nice weekend. As always, before we get started, can you just confirm that you can see me, you can hear me, and you can see the PPT. You should see the slide, oligopoly and collusion. Okay, good. So the plan for tonight, is to finish talking about collusion, something we started during our last webinar. In particular, we need to have a look at the different types of collusion. You know that there are two main types. There is tacit collusion and formal collusion. So we'll have a look at these two types. And we need to discuss the stability of a collusive agreement, in which case we can expect collusion to be stable within an oligopolistic market, and in which case it is going to be more difficult for firms to stick to a collusive agreement. Simply, we will show that in some markets there are strong incentives to cheat. Basically, we agree to collude, but then one firm is going to cheat, to deviate, or to break the agreement. And once we are done with that, we'll have a look at the last topic of this module, which is about the kinked demand curve model, which is a model that can explain why prices tend to be stable and even sticky in an oligopolistic market, even though firms are not colluding. Okay, so that's going to take us about 45 minutes to 1 hour. And as always, if you have any question, any remark, anything that you want to say, feel free to say so. You can unmute your mic, or you can simply type something in the chat box. Okay, so let's just summarize. We started talking about collusion last week. I gave the definition of what collusion is, and then we had a look, and this is what we did last. We had a look at this game, which is a very typical collusion game where each firm has the opportunity to charge a high price, which will be seen as the cooperative or the collusive strategy, or to charge a low price, which is the aggressive or non-cooperative strategy. And we saw that this game is a good illustration of the prisoner's dilemma, where collectively they would have an incentive to collude and to keep prices high. So each of them could get $4,000 or $4 million in profit. But because each of them has an incentive to deviate from this collusive agreement, a high price is not a Nash equilibrium. It's not a combination of best responses, which means that each firm will have an incentive to deviate from this agreement, and we will end up in the worst possible situation where each firm will charge a low price and will make a relatively low profit. So in this case, collusion is not stable. We will see why it is not possible in what we call a one-shot game. And it's never possible to achieve a collusive agreement if we only repeat the game once. Okay, so let's have a look at the two main forms of collusion. Let's start with formal collusion, simply because that's the easiest to analyze. So formal collusion is simply a situation where you have rival companies and they enter into it's not a formal agreement in order to limit competition and to maximize their joint profit. So joint profit is the profit that they make all together. So you add the profit of all these firms, and all together, when you add all the profit that they make, you have what we call joint profit. So instead of having different firms who are going to maximize their individual profit, we are going to have a group of business, and their objective is going to maximize the total cake that they will have, the total profit that they will make. You can see that something similar would be one business that has multiple plants, for example, multiple factories, and this business will make decisions in order to maximize the total profit that will be made by all these factories. It's pretty much the same thing. So formal collusion in an oligopolistic market is equivalent to a monopolistic market in which the single seller would have different factories, different plants, and will make decisions to maximize the total profit made by all these plants. Okay. Formal agreement and not formal. Let me correct that right away. So, okay. Formal means that you could call that a written agreement. Okay, it's not as we will see. This is different from tacit. So they actually meet. They meet. So they might do that in secret because collusion is illegal in most countries. But they will meet, talk, and reach a formal agreement about how they will effectively limit competition in order to maximize their joint profit. So there is some form of communication between these firms, some form of direct communication, and they will formally agree to limit competition. Again, formal collusion does not mean that collusion is open for everyone to see. Even if you have formal collusion between different businesses, most of the time it is some kind of secret or covert collusion simply because it is illegal. There is one exception. I don't know if I mentioned it. Yeah, this is what I mentioned at the end. So formal collusion can either be overt, open for everyone to see, or covert, designed to be hidden from legal authorities. Most of the time, formal collusion is covert, hidden, secret. There is one exception, which is the OPEC. The OPEC is a group, not really a group of businesses, but a group of countries that agree to limit competition, and they agree on how much oil they will extract every year or over a given period of time. So it is a form of collusion. Is this illegal? It's difficult to tell simply because you see that in this case, in the case of the OPEC, you do not have collusion between businesses within a particular country. This is a form of collusion between countries. So I'm not a lawyer, but I don't really know what type of law would apply to punish this type of behavior. So it's difficult to tell whether it is legal or not from that perspective. And because they cannot be punished by any legal authority, these countries don't really hide, and every 6 months they organize an OPEC meeting when they will decide what the extraction quotas for each country are going to be. Okay, and the purpose of usually the purpose of this formal collusive agreement is to either to restrict output or to keep prices high. It depends on what type of market we have. Again, it depends on what type of competition there is in this market. Is this mostly, what is the variable of competition? Is this quantity competition like Corno oligopoly, or is this price competition like Bertrand oligopoly? It depends, but basically the idea is to reduce output, keep the price high. And a keyword that your students need to know is the keyword cartel. So many of them are actually confused between what is the difference between formal collusion and a cartel. Formal collusion is a behavior. It's a strategy, if you want to put it this way. It's a practice. It's an anti-competitive practice. A cartel is a group of business who are engaged in formal collusion. I repeat, the cartel is a group of firms or countries, in the case of the OPEC, who are engaged in formal collusion. Okay, I hope now you see the difference between formal collusion and a cartel. Formal collusion is a practice, a cartel is a group of businesses. Okay, I see there is a comment on the chat box. Is strategic alliance companies part of formal collusion? It's a good question. I guess it's not up to economists to tell whether it is considered as formal collusion or not. It's mostly a matter of law. I would say that if the strategic alliance is compatible with the anti-competitive or the antitrust policies, so if it's not illegal, then this would probably not be considered formal collusion. But if this strategic alliance is illegal, if it goes against the antitrust or the competition policy within the country, then I guess this would be considered formal collusion. So it really depends on what's behind this strategic alliance. If it's something open for everyone to see, it's not likely to be formal collusion, because again, in most countries, formal collusion is something illegal. They are, in each country, there are competition authorities whose job is to screen markets, to analyze what's going on in markets, to identify illegal collusive agreements. If it is a hidden strategic alliance, then this might be hiding some kind of formal collusion. So it's difficult to tell. It really depends on what's behind the alliance. Okay, and the other type of collusion is tacit. So first thing that you should say is to explain what tacit means, because I think most of your students will not know this word. It's going to be a new word for them. It means understood without being stated. Sometimes you need to say the words for people to understand something. Sometimes you just have to give, it's like when a student is talking too much during your class, you don't necessarily have to tell the student you are talking too much. You just have to look at the student to stop talking. You look at the student and the student will understand that you think that he or she is talking too much. So this is tacit form of communication. So tacit collusion occurs when rival firms enter into an unwritten agreement. So unwritten agreement would be the opposite of a formal agreement, which basically means that they do not actually communicate. They do not send each other emails, or they don't meet in a bar or anything. They never really meet. They never communicate directly. But still, they enter into an unwritten agreement aimed at restricting competition. So then your students might not really understand how this works. How is this possible to reach some kind of agreement if we never communicate? And there are basically two ways firms can coordinate. This is really a matter of coordination. And how are they going to do that? They are going to observe each other. They are going to look at what their rivals are doing. So this could be, they are going to look at the price that will be charged by their rivals. They are going to look at the marketing strategy, for example. They are going to look at their strategy in terms of where they will choose to locate their new stores or their new factories, so they can look at their expansion strategy. And they will use this information to extract information about what is the strategy of my rivals, what are they trying to achieve. And through this information, looking at what is going on in the market, they can actually send each other messages through the market. So for example, if I am one business in this market, and if I raise the price, I send a signal to my competitors, and the content of this signal is, I do not want to engage in a price war with you. This could be something like that if I raise the price. On the other hand, if I cut the price, this would be an aggressive signal that I send to my competitors. This would be a signal that means I want to fight. So what you have to understand is that in tacit collusion, firms are going to use market signals like price signals to communicate and to make their intentions understood by their competitors. Okay, so there are two different main things that your students need to know about how they can actually coordinate. The first type of coordination mechanism is what we call price leadership. So price leadership is when you have usually the biggest or most important firm within the market that you can describe as the leader, who is going to set the price. This firm is effectively price maker. And then the smaller businesses, the smaller firms are going to follow this price. So for example, I am the biggest company, I charge a price of $10. Then all the smaller businesses with whom I am competing are going to charge $10 as well. We call that a follow the leader informal agreement. And you see that in that case, we don't have to meet, we don't have to engage into any formal agreement to coordinate. At the end of the day, we will all be charging the same price, even though we have not met. We have just waited for the leader to set the initial price, and everyone is just copying or charging exactly the same price. So that's one way to coordinate and to engage in collusion, even though we never effectively meet. Another strategy which is very similar, it's what we call barometric price leadership. So here in that case, it's almost the same idea. You will have one business in the market that is going to set the price, and other firms are going to follow. They are going to charge the exact same price. What is the difference between price leadership and barometric price leadership? Is that if you only talk about price leadership, it usually means that you have one big firm that will set the price. The dominant firm sets the price and the other ones, the smaller ones, follow. Barometric price leadership, in this case, it's not necessarily the dominant firm that is going to set the price, that is going to act as the leader in this market, but instead it's going to be the firm that is considered to be the best judge of market conditions. The firm that, as I indicate there, that has consistently been seen to judge market conditions accurately over time, and therefore is seen as a good barometer of market trends. It doesn't have to be the largest firm in the market, okay? This is not very important though. If your students only remember price leadership, or you have one dominant firm that sets the price, it's absolutely fine. Okay, there might be other rules where there is a mutual understanding, such that we have to keep advertising expenditures low, these type of things. Doesn't really matter. But what is important is that tacit collusion firms, they never actually meet, they never directly communicate, they send each other messages, signals through the market. They see what happens in the market, and they can guess what are the intentions of their rivals. Okay. Are we good so far? Do you have any questions? Shall we move on? Okay, let's talk about stability then. The objective here is to find out in which case collusion is likely to work, and in which case it's going to be difficult to reach an agreement. And there are many, many parameters, and there are many MCQs that test this particular knowledge. So the problem is that when firms agree to collude, the objective is no longer to maximize their individual profit. The objective is to maximize the collective or joint profit. And this might lead to tensions within the cartel. Okay, that's what I write here. Firms within the collusive agreement, particularly those with lower cost, have an incentive to break ranks. Break ranks means to defect, not to follow the agreement, and increase their own output or sell at a lower price in order to increase their individual profit. What you can imagine is, just try to imagine a situation where we have two businesses. So it's a duopoly, only two firms within this market. And they meet and they agree to collude, okay? But one of them is more efficient at producing. It has a lower cost of production than the other. In this case, you see that it's going to be difficult for these two firms to be able to collude and to stick to a collusive agreement, simply because the firm that is more efficient, that has a lower cost of production, would actually benefit from competition, right? Because in this case, it could charge a lower price than its competitor, and it might be able to drive this competitor out of the market, to kill it. This is what we call predatory pricing. So one factor that makes collusion difficult, as we will see, is that if the firms within the market, they have different cost structures, which means you have firms that have very low costs of production and firms that have very high cost of production. Of course, the firms with the very high cost of production, they have an incentive to collude. They don't want to fight. They don't want to engage in a price war simply because they would lose. But those firms with a very low cost of production, they don't really have an incentive to collude. Why would they collude? They could just fight and they know that they would win. So in which case is this actually easier for collusion to work? This would be a situation where all the firms within the market have the same cost of production or similar cost of production, because in this case they would all lose a lot from the price war. There would not be a clear winner. They would all have to sacrifice much of their profit in the long run. So in that case, collusion is very appealing. They have strong incentives to collude and keep prices high simply because they know how costly the price war would be. That's the first point. Yeah. Why is it possible that collusion is going to work? Simply because after the firms agree not to fight, so they meet, for example, in the case of formal collusion, they meet and they agree to keep prices high, then of course, each firm will have an incentive to cheat, to defect. So for example, we all meet today, we say, hey, let's charge a high price, and then I have an incentive tomorrow to cheat and to charge a low price. And I would very much benefit from this strategy, because in this case, if all my competitors charge a high price and I charge a low price, I have all the market for me. All the buyers will be willing to buy from me. So tomorrow, I can make a lot of profit if I cheat. But if I do that tomorrow, what is going to happen the day after tomorrow? All the other businesses with whom I compete know that I have cheated, that I have not respected the agreement. And in this case, they will stop, let's put it this way, they will no longer be willing to work with me, to cooperate with me. So if I cheat tomorrow, then working together, cooperation will never be possible again. And I will lose very much from cheating. So when we looked at the game before, and I said, if we only play the game once, it is not possible that firms will collude. This is simply because if you only play the game once, it's not possible to punish firms who have cheated. So if we agree to charge a high price, but tomorrow one of them charges a low price, because we only play the game once, there is no way we can punish this firm. And of course, if I know that I can't be punished because we only play the game once, I will cheat. I have an incentive to cheat. The only way collusion can be stable is when firms know that they will be interacting with their competitors over a long period of time. They know that if they cheat tomorrow, this will have very severe consequences in the future because we will then fight. It will no longer be possible to cooperate. So this is one of the major factors that can allow collusion to be stable. Firms must anticipate that they will be competing, the same firms will be competing over the long run. If it's not the case, they anticipate that they will not be punished if they do not respect the collusive agreement, and they will have a strong incentive to cheat, to defect. Okay, so that's what I write here. Each member has an incentive to defect, to cheat, but there is a risk of retaliation. If I cheat, I will be punished in the future. And punishment might take the form of a price war where everybody would lose from a price war. So, okay, you have an example with the OPEC. All OPEC members are aware that Saudi Arabia, which can be seen as the dominant member of this cartel, is in a position to flood the market with oil thereby significantly reduce its price, which would penalize all members. So if you have, let's say, Venezuela that decides to defect, Venezuela is given one extraction quota and it chooses to extract more, then Saudi Arabia might retaliate and extract much more oil than what was planned given the quota. The consequence would be a complete collapse of the price of oil, and Venezuela, as well as all OPEC countries, would be severely hurt or damaged by such a strategy. So that's the idea of a retaliation if you have one member that does not stick to the collusive agreement. And in which case are we going to say that collusion is stable? We will say that collusion is stable if the incentives to cooperate, not to cheat, are stronger than the incentive to defect. In this case, we have stability. Simple. This is not so important. Okay, we can leave this aside. So now let's have a closer look at the situations in which it is hard for firms to collude. So basically, what I'm going to list in this slide are the factors that are such that there are strong incentives to defect, to cheat, to break the collusive agreement. The first one is that when there is a large number of firms, simply because it is more complicated to coordinate. If you have 2 firms, 3 firms, 4 firms, it's rather easy to coordinate, to keep track of the strategy of all business, to make sure that they have not cheated. But if you have 10, 20, 30 firms that are part of this collusive agreement, it's going to be much more difficult to make it whole together, to make sure that everybody plays by the rules, that nobody is cheating. So usually, yeah, the larger the number of firms, the greater the possibility that at least one key participant will refuse to collude. So if you have a duopoly, for example, collusion tends to be relatively easy, simply because you only have 2 firms. So it's going to be quite easy for them to agree to send signals to each other, or even to meet to form a collusive agreement. If you have 30 firms in a business, or even 10, you understand that it's going to be much more difficult to reach any form of agreement, formal or tacit. A second factor that makes it difficult to collude is the monitoring of price and output levels is difficult. As we said, collusion is often about agreeing on a given price, we all charge the same price, or agreeing on how much we produce. But of course, if we want collusion to be stable, we must be able to punish those who have not respected the agreement. So we need information about what they have done. If we agreed that we should charge a price of $10, I need to be able to monitor the price of my rivals to make sure that they have not cheated. So sometimes there are some industries in which it might be difficult for businesses to know the price that has been charged by their competitors. It's not all businesses have prices that are public, that you can just go to the store and look at which price they have sold their goods and services. There might be some prices that they only send to their customers in private. So in this case, it might be complicated to make sure that your competitors have not cheated, that they have effectively charged the price that you had agreed collectively. And if it's the case, you don't know if they have cheated, so you can't punish them, and therefore they have an incentive to cheat. Another example is a market where there are low barriers to entry. If there are low barriers to entry, of course, if we collude, we will make more profit than if we were competing. And this extra profit will attract new firms into the market. And we don't know if these firms will be willing to join the collusive agreement or not. And as I said earlier, the more firms you have in the market, the more complicated it is to achieve a stable collusive agreement. On the other hand, if you have high barriers to entry, let's say you only have 3 firms, and if they are protected by high barriers to entry, even if they make very high economic profit, nobody will be able to enter and threaten the stability of the collusive agreement. Next point, as I explained earlier, when firms have different cost structures, which is very intuitive in this case, firms that have the lowest cost of production have an incentive to cheat, to defect, to charge a low price, because they know that they will win in case they are competing with their less efficient competitors. Next, when buyers have some bargaining power, when there is a market power on the demand side, simply because if you have a collusive agreement between, let's say, two firms and they agree to charge a high price, but then you have a big buyer that talks to one of these companies and say, well, you know what, the price that you charge is too high. If you do not agree to reduce the price, then I will buy from your competitor. And if this is a very important buyer, you really need the business from that particular buyer, then you might, as a business, you might have to agree to reduce the price in order to make sure that you do not lose this very important customer. So if you have very, very small customers that have no market power at all, if they have no bargaining power, if they ask you to charge a lower price, you can say, no, it's no big deal. Even if you lose a very small customer, that's no big deal. But if this is a very important customer, you can't really afford to lose that customer. So if it asks you to cut the price, you might be forced to do so, even if this means that you have to break, to defect from the collusive agreement. And if you have an industry that is immature, which means that things change very fast, so you have rapid changes in market conditions, this creates uncertainty. And of course, if you have more uncertainty, it's more difficult to achieve a collusive agreement that is going to be stable over time. It's going to be difficult to reach an agreement simply because we don't really know what's going to happen in the future. Okay, so you have these different elements that make it more difficult for a collusive agreement to hold, to remain stable over time in an oligopolistic market. What is a good example for for an immature industry? So let's try to find an example. Immature oligopolistic industry. I don't know. We all often give the example of AI. Why not? It's no longer an infant industry, but it's changing really very quickly. This is usually IT because it's mostly related to technology. So I guess using the example of AI would be relevant. You could use the example of quantum computing as well. You could use blockchain technologies, this type of IT businesses where you have a few big businesses, not necessarily Bitcoin, because this is not really, well, this is simply a currencies, but just say blockchain in general. It's much broader than just cryptocurrencies. So yeah, this is something that is the environment, the technological environment is changing very, very quickly. So this would be an example of an immature industry. Yeah. So in this case, you don't really know what's going to happen in a few years. So it's difficult to make to anticipate much. So reaching an agreement about what we should do to limit competition is not as easy as if you looked at the market for some kind of agricultural commodity, where it's much easier to make forecasts about the future demand for a given commodity, for example, or a market for a particular mineral resource that is much more mature. Any other questions about the factors that make it more difficult to achieve a collusive agreement? Can the cooperative be seen as part of collusion? Yes, of course. A collusive agreement is a cooperative behavior where firms will not fight, they will cooperate in order to maximize their joint profit. Yes. Any other question? Are we good? Okay, so let's just say a few words about collusion and law. This is not something that is tested in A2, so I could have added a one step further star over here. This is mostly for AP, so I don't know if any of you is teaching AP. For AP, there are a few things that are about collusion and law. Basically, the main thing that you should take to your students, especially if those taking the Cambridge curriculum. Cooperative can be classified as oligopoly. I'm not sure I understand your question, William. An oligopoly is a market structure. Cooperative is more like cooperative behavior. It's a market conduct. It's the way firms behave. So it's not really the market structure itself, is how the participants in the market, how they behave. So within an oligopoly, you can have situations where firms will cooperate, and you can call that collusion. It could be formal collusion or it could be tacit collusion. Or you could have a situation where firms will fight very aggressively. What do you call cooperative then? I'm not sure I understand what you mean. Can you explain to me, William, what you mean by cooperative? What you mean was a farm business or other organization which is owned and run jointly by its member who share the profit or benefits. Yeah, but then, okay. Then you don't have different businesses. Collusion is a situation where you have different businesses, different entities that cooperate. The example that you give, if you talk about a cooperative, it's only, it really depends on the ownership. If it's a common ownership, as your definition seems to suggest it, then it's one single entity. So you can't define that as collusion because there is a common ownership. Collusion is when you have different entities with different ownership that will cooperate. So if you have this cooperative, like different farmers, and that create together one single entity, then this would simply be one business. Okay? One business that would have different plants, different fields, for example, that would be run or managed by different people, different farmers, for example. But at the end of the day, if this is one single ownership, this is just one single business. So you can't really consider that an oligopoly, or you can't call that collusion, in my opinion. You need to have different entities, separate entities. Okay, so emphasize collusion is illegal. Yes, so that's why most firms who engage in collusion, they hide. Yes. And then in my PPT, I give some examples of what we call antitrust laws or competition laws whose objective is to limit cooperative behavior, to make sure that firms don't engage in any form of collusion. So the next slides, I'm not going to talk about that, but you have some examples of competition laws in the US, in the UK, whose objective is to limit this type of anti-competitive practices. So you can have a look at that. This is not going to be very useful for A2. This might be useful for AP though. I have another handout where I give more information about that. This is one of my AP PPT from AP Microeconomics, from the last chapter, Market Failures and the Role of Government. I think one is called Market Power, or I forgot the name of the PPT, but this is the last chapter, and I give more information about competition law and antitrust laws in the US mostly. Okay, good. So we can move on to the last topic of this module on oligopoly, which is the kinked demand curve model, which is for some reason something that students really struggle with. So I'll try to explain it in the easiest possible way. So here's how you should start. You should just start by saying that in oligopolistic markets, the statistics suggest that prices tend to be more stable over time than in other market structures, than perfect competition, more stable than in monopoly. So how can we explain it? Usually your students will tell you, well, this is perhaps because firms are colluding. Yeah, they have agreed either in a tacit way or in a formal way. They have agreed on a certain price, and that's why the price remains stable, simply because the collusive agreement, collusion, is stable. So they keep the same price. Okay, and we have price stability. Yes, it is one possibility. But there is another possibility, there is another way to explain why prices might be stable over time in an oligopolistic market, even though firms do not collude, even though firms do not cooperate, even though they are effectively competing with each other. And this model, which has another name, the kinked demand curve model, the other name, perhaps you have seen it, we also call that the Swidzi or Swidzi, I don't really know how to pronounce it, oligopoly. This is the other name of the kinked demand curve model, because Swidzi is the name of the economist who came up with this model in the 1930s. It's quite old. I forgot exactly when it was. Sorry. Okay, so what is the objective? It's really important to understand what is the objective, what this model wants to show. The objective of this model is to provide a non-cooperative rationale, so an explanation for the observed price stability in some oligopolistic markets. So we have observed that prices are stable. How can we explain it? We could just say that they are colluding. This model provides another explanation. Even when firms compete, there might be some kind of price stability. So how does it work? Let me read the chat box. I see that there is something. Okay, 1939. Thank you, Meisu. So I was not too far. 1930. I was just 1 year away from being wrong. So this model shows that non-cooperative oligopolies, so basically firms who fight, may have no interest in moving away from a pre-established equilibrium. So there is a pre-established equilibrium, and actually we don't really know how we got there. The model doesn't explain how we got there, but we are at some point, we have some given price in the market and some given equilibrium quantity. And this model explains that in this case, each firm has no incentive to raise the price and no incentive to reduce the price. So they will not change the price over time, and therefore we will have price stability. This is what this model explains. So how does it work? Basically, the idea is that each business will make expectations, or will have expectations about what their competitors will do if they change their own price. For example, and this is what this model assumes. This model assumes that each firm believes, this is all about what they believe. They might be wrong, but these are beliefs. Each firm believes that if it raises its own price, their competitors will not raise their own prices, okay? So let's just take the example with two firms, okay? I am firm A, and throughout this model, I will be firm A, and my rival is firm B. There is a given price. This is where we are right now. We sell our product at $10, and I believe that if I raise my price from $10 to $11, my competitor will keep its own price at $10. So the consequence is that I expect to lose many customers, simply because I have a higher price, but my competitor has a lower price now. So I expect to lose many customers. On the other hand, I have a different expectation if I decrease my price. If I decrease my price, I believe that my competitor is going to do the same thing. So if I cut my price from $10 to $9, I believe that my competitor will do the same thing. So in this case, the reason for which I cut my price was to gain more customers. But if my competitor, if firm B also decreases its own price, am I going to gain market shares? Not really. I might gain some customers because the price is lower, so the quantity demanded is higher. But in terms of market shares, if my competitor also decreases its price, I will still have a 50-50 market share, for example. Okay, so let's try to see, we will on a diagram what the consequence will be. But let's try to summarize the idea. Let me erase that. Okay. So if an oligopolist increases its price, it expects or it believes that its rivals will maintain their initial price. The consequence is that the oligopolist expects to lose many consumers if it does that. It has a higher price now than its competitor. So if I raise the price, I expect that the quantity demanded to me will decrease a lot. So in other words, I expect that my individual demand is relatively price elastic above the initial price. If I raise the price, I lose many customers, so the demand I face is relatively elastic. On the other hand, if I decrease the price, I expect that, I believe, that my rivals will do the same thing. So if we both decrease the price, I expect to attract only few customers. So I reduce the price and the quantity demanded only increases a little. So basically it means that I believe that the demand I face is relatively price inelastic below the initial equilibrium price. If I decrease the price below the equilibrium price, I don't expect to gain many customers. Okay? So the consequence is that I expect my demand to be elastic above the initial price, so relatively flat. I expect the demand I face to be relatively price inelastic below the equilibrium price, so relatively steep. So we see that there will be a sudden change in slope, relatively flat above P1 and suddenly steep below P1. And this change in slope is what we call a kink, a sudden change in slope. And that's why we call that the kinked demand, simply because this demand has a sudden change in slope at the initial equilibrium price. The consequence, it doesn't really matter really, but if you want to tell that to your students, is that the marginal revenue curve will have what we call a jump discontinuity, simply because the marginal revenue, well, I'll show you that later. I'll show you the explanation later. It's going to be better than a long speech, but we'll see that on the diagram. It's going to be much easier. Okay, I'll explain that with the diagram also. It will be much easier. So when you think about it, why are we going to have price stability? We start from the equilibrium price. If I raise the price, I believe that I will lose many customers because my competitor keeps the price quite low. So is this a good idea to raise the price? No. I would lose profit if I decided to raise the price. So I should not raise the price. Is this a good idea to cut the price, to decrease the price? In that case, I don't expect to gain many customers because my rival is also going to cut its price. So the only thing that I will, the only consequence is that I will sell my product at a lower price and I will make less profit than before. So you see that in both cases, I will make less profit. If I raise the price, I make less profit. If I decrease the price, I make less profit. So what is the consequence? What should I do? Nothing. I should just keep charging the same price as before. And this is how we can explain price stability. And you see, what's important is that we haven't talked about collusion here. We don't have price stability because firm A has talked to firm B and they have agreed or anything. They are simply afraid. They are simply afraid of the consequences of increasing or decreasing their prices. And maybe they are wrong, maybe their expectations are incorrect, but since they will never change the price, they will never find out whether their expectations were right or wrong. So what I explained, I probably explained it somewhere in this slide. Yeah, price stability, this is the last one. Price stability is driven by the sole fear of rivals' potential reaction to changes in prices. Yeah, the oligopolist believes it is neither optimal to increase nor to decrease the price. So we will have price stability, and since they cannot really compete in price, they are afraid of increasing or decreasing the price, so they must find other ways to compete. This might be by engaging in non-price competition. We talked about that last time. And as I said, since they will not change the price, they will never know, and this is something that I find funny about this model, they will never know if they are right or wrong because they will not change the price. The only way they could find out if their expectations are correct would be to effectively increase or decrease the price, and then they would see what is the effective reaction of their rivals. But since they are afraid of changing the price, they will keep the same price and they will never find out whether they were right or wrong. Unless they could reduce its cost of production. You mean that they would cut the price if they could reduce their cost of production? Is this what you mean? Yes, but as we will see, we need a significant reduction in the cost of production. I'll show you that on the diagram. If you can only decrease your cost of production a little bit, it's not going to change the outcome. You need to have like a significant cost advantage. You'll see that on the diagram. Okay, how do we graph it? Okay, well, I'll talk about price stickiness on the diagram as well. This is not important. Let's just graph it. So we start from this price. So that's the equilibrium price. We don't really explain how we got there, and the equilibrium quantity. And I'm going to graph the individual demand facing each oligopolist. Above P star, I believe that I face a demand that is relatively price elastic, because if I raise the price above P star, I will be the only one raising the price. So my product will be more expensive than all my rivals, and therefore I will lose many customers. So I expect that my demand, AR1, is my average revenue, which is my demand curve, above P1 is relatively flat, relatively price inelastic. Below P star, I expect that my demand is relatively price inelastic, simply because if I cut the price, my rivals will do the same and I will not gain many customers. Okay, so relatively steeper. So it's not very clear. So we have the change in slope is not so clear. I did that so I could really graph the marginal revenue curves precisely. Okay. Okay, we would have something like that. So you see, I have basically my demand curve is the blue curve, or the two lines that we have there, and you see that it is made of two sections, one section above P1 and one section below P1. And the MR curve, same thing, there are two sections. You have this first section, which is the marginal revenue associated with this section of the demand curve. And you see that it has the same vertical intercept, we know that, and it is twice steeper. You know that when demand is a straight line, the marginal revenue has the same intercept as the demand curve, and it's just twice steeper. And let me see if I can continue to show you. Then we have a second section of the demand curve. If I continue it, it would go somewhere here. So that's if I continue it, and if I continue the marginal revenue over there, I don't know if it's precise. Well, not too bad. Okay, that's not too bad. So you see what we have. Actually, perhaps I can use some colors. It would would be better. And yeah, basically this would continue like that. Okay, my demand curve would continue there, and my margin revenue would continue there. So they would meet exactly, they would have the same positive intercept, and this would continue. This could continue like that, and this continue like that. Okay, does it make sense? So you basically have these two demand curves, these two margin revenue curve, and above P star you are on one particular demand curve, and below P star you are on the other demand curve. Simply because you have different expectations about what your rivals will do if you increase or if you decrease the price. And you see something interesting about the MR curve. Let me erase that. You see that at Q star, you see that it jumps. I'll try to graph it. It jumps from this value here to this value there. Okay, this is what we call the jump discontinuity. So it goes down and there is a sudden jump and then it keeps decreasing, and then if it would keep going, it would be negative starting from here. Okay, so that is the shape of your demand curve in the kinked demand curve model, and this is the shape of the margin revenue curve. So for A2, what really matters is the shape of the demand curve. So it's okay if your students don't graph the marginal revenue curve. I like to graph it simply to illustrate why it's not going to be worth it for firms to change the price. And this is what I'm going to do right now, and that's pretty much going to be the conclusion of today's webinar. What is important to realize is that the marginal cost must go through this vertical section. Do you understand why? Do you understand why when we graph the marginal cost, it has to go through this vertical section? Simply because if it were, let me try to graph another one. If we graphed it here, for example, okay, let's call that MC2. If we graphed it here, then Q star would no longer be the optimal quantity. This would no longer be the equilibrium quantity. In order to maximize its profit, the firms would choose MC is equal to MR. So we would be there, right? MC is equal to MR. We would actually be there. Oops, hola, what's going on? We would be there. We would not be at Q star. And if I graphed it too low, let's graph another one. For example, here. Let's call this one MC3. Up. Then same thing, Q star would not be the equilibrium quantity. This would not be the pre-established equilibrium. In that case, the pre-established equilibrium again would be where MC is equal to MR in order to maximize profit. MR, MC, it would be right here. MC is equal to MR. Okay. So the only way you can make sure that Q star is indeed your pre-established equilibrium is by making sure that your marginal cost is going through your marginal revenue at this on this particular vertical section, because you see that indeed when the marginal cost goes through this vertical section, then MC is equal to MR at Q star. So we can justify that Q star is indeed the pre-established equilibrium. So if you want to graph the MR curve and if you want to graph the marginal cost curve, make sure that you make it go through the jump discontinuity over here. And now we can prove that the firm will not have an incentive to change its price. You see, it's not very complicated to justify it. So we start from here. What if, let's put it this way, the oligopolist increases its price so that it sells 1 unit less, just 1 unit less. So we need to see what the firm gains. and what? The firm loses. So if we sell one less unit, it means that we don't have to produce that last unit. So our cost of production decreases because we produce less than before. Because we just produce one less unit, our cost of production will decrease by the marginal cost. So we save the marginal cost of production. It's a gain. It's a gain because it's a lower cost. So that is what will increase our profit. And we can see that. Where is the marginal cost at Q star? It's there, MC star. Let me underline it so it's clear for everyone. So this is what we gain if we choose to raise the price to sell one less unit. But of course, if we sell one less unit, our total revenue will decrease. By what amount? If we just sell one less unit than before, my total revenue will decrease by an amount equal to the marginal revenue. And if I start from here, from Q star, and I raise the price, so I'm going to move, I sell one less unit, so I move to the left, right? I sell one less unit than before. So where is the marginal revenue? Slightly to the left of Q star, it is exactly there, MR1, okay? This is the marginal revenue at Q star minus 1. You can put it this way. This is the upper section of the marginal revenue curve. So let me summarize. If we raise the price, so we sell one less unit, what we gain is a lower cost of production, MC. That's what is going to increase our profit. But we lose some revenue. We receive less revenue than before. We lose the marginal revenue. And you see on the diagram that what we have lost, MR1, is greater than what we have gained, MC. So, conclusion, if we raise the price so that we sell one less unit, our profit would effectively decrease. Should we raise the price? No. We see that very clearly on the diagram. Next case, perhaps we should cut the price. Let's see if it's going to work. What's going to happen if I cut the price? So I reduce the price, same thing, so I sell one more unit. So what's bad for me, what is going to decrease my profit, is that I have to produce more. I have to produce one more unit. So my total cost of production is going to increase by the cost of producing one more unit, the marginal cost. So same thing, at Q star, the marginal cost, it's there. So this is what I have to pay to produce one more unit. But of course, what's good for me is that if I produce one more unit, I can sell it. And if I sell it, this will increase my total revenue as long as my marginal revenue is positive. In this case, it is. My total revenue will increase by the marginal revenue. And because we cut the price to sell one more unit, so we move to the right of Q star plus 1. This would be our new output. So the marginal revenue is there, MR2, on the lower section of the marginal revenue curve. So you see now that what you have to pay to produce one more unit is greater than what you receive from the sale of one additional unit. So again, your cost of production is greater than your revenue from that last unit. So if you do that, if you cut the price to sell one more unit, again, your profit would decrease. So you see that regardless of what you do, if you increase the price or if you cut the price, in both cases, you will have a lower profit. So what should you do? You should just maintain the initial price P star and sell the quantity Q star. This is how you believe, it's all about expectations. This is how you believe that you will have the largest possible profit. And what is interesting in this model is that it can also explain price stickiness. Let me go back a bit. Yeah. Usually in classical economic theory, as long as you change a little bit the marginal cost or the marginal revenue, this will lead to a change in the quantity that you should produce to maximize your profit. Okay, MC is equal to MR is the optimum output rule. So if you just change MC a little bit or MR a little bit, your behavior, your optimal level of production will change. And as a result, the equilibrium price will also change. But in this case, in this model, because we have this jump discontinuity, because we have this vertical section, if we change the marginal cost a bit, this will not lead to a change in the equilibrium quantity. And this situation is known as price stickiness. The resistance of price to change, if we change the marginal cost, the quantity that I produce remains the same and therefore the price remains the same, is known as price stickiness. So something changes, but the price remains exactly the same. We can see that on this diagram. Look, so we start from there, MC1. So you see that, let me add the vertical section. It will be easier to see it. It will be easier to convince ourselves. Okay, so when we have this cost structure, MC is equal to MR at Q star. So Q star is the profit maximizing quantity. And to sell this profit maximizing quantity, we should charge a price of P star. What if the marginal cost changes? What if it changes from MC1 to MC2? Does it change the quantity that we should produce? No. We see that with this new marginal cost curve, we still have MC is equal to MR at Q star. So we should still produce the same quantity of output, and therefore we should still charge the same price. So even though the marginal cost has changed, the price remains the same. This is what we call price stickiness. What if the marginal cost decreases from M1 to M3? Same thing. We still have MC is equal to MR at Q star. So we should always produce Q star, and we should always charge the price P star. So you see that for small changes, and this is why I mentioned something like we need a big change in the cost of production, but for small changes in the cost of production, the optimal quantity will not change and the optimal price will not change. Only if you have a change in the cost structure that is sufficiently significant. So for example, if you have, let me use another color. If you have something like, oh, that's going to be a very ugly color, but let's try. Ooh, beautiful. Only if you have something like that, MC4. So this would be a significant reduction in your cost of production. In this case, you would have a change in the equilibrium quantity. MC is equal to MR would now be right here. And as a result, you would also have a change in the equilibrium price. The equilibrium price would be okay, right there, okay? So you would no longer have price stickiness. But for small enough changes in the marginal cost of production, as long as the marginal cost curve cuts the marginal revenue in this vertical section, then the business, the oligopolist will not change its behavior. This is what we call price stickiness. Okay. Does it make sense? Then there is something about the limitations, but it's not very, it's really self-explanatory, so I don't want to say too much about that. Yes. I think I said everything about the kinked demand curve model. So let me summarize what I think is important briefly. What is the objective of the model? It's to explain price stability in oligopolistic markets, even when firms do not collude. And what is the explanation here? Firms do not change the price because they are afraid of what their rivals would do if they change their price. They have pessimistic expectations. You can put it this way. They always anticipate what's the worst for them. They always believe that if they change anything, their competitors is going to behave in a way that is bad for them. So they are afraid of the reactions, of the potential reactions of their competitors. And as a result, the best thing that they believe they should do is to keep the same price. So that's the first thing that this model can explain. And the second thing that this model can explain is price stickiness. Even if the marginal cost changes, the firm will not change its quantity of output. Q star will still be the quantity that maximizes its profit. So even if we have small changes in the cost structure of oligopolists, this will not affect the quantity and the price that they will charge. So there are actually two main ideas behind this kinked demand curve model. Does it make sense? Do you have questions? So based on the example, M4 is the optimum price and quantity for the firm to make profit. Yes, but what is interesting is that, you mean when I drew MC4 here, right? When I did something like that. When I did this, MC4. Well, the firm will always produce where MC is equal to MR. So if the marginal cost is there, MC4, then the quantity at which profit will be maximized will be there. MC is equal to MR. And if I want to sell this quantity, then I need to find the demand price at this quantity, and I just read the price that I should charge to sell this particular level of output. But what is interesting is that this quantity, let's give it a name. Let's call that Q4, because this is MC4. And let's call this price P4. What is interesting is that this quantity and this price are not necessarily the quantity and the price that will actually maximize the firm's profit. P4 and Q4 are the price and output combination that the firm believes is optimal. Because again, the demand curve that we have there, the blue curve or the blue lines, might not be the real demand curve. It is just the demand curve that the oligopolist believes it faces. It believes that this is the way consumers would respond to changes in prices. But this business may be wrong. Perhaps the demand will be more inelastic above P star, or perhaps the demand will be more price elastic below P star. It's all about expectations, what we believe. And again, since they will never change the price, they will just keep the price at P star, they will never really know what is the real shape of the demand curve that they face. This is just what they believe they face. So they believe that if the marginal cost is MC4, they believe that they should indeed charge a price P4 to sell output Q4, but they may be wrong. Absolutely. This entire model is based on what we expect, what businesses expect, about the expectations they have about their environments, and especially about the way their competitors will behave, will react to changes in prices. But in this model, it's not really about having market information, because what type of market information are you thinking of? It's not really information about the size of the market. It's really about what firms will do, because you could have information about how many buyers you have in the market. You could have information about the price at which they're willing to buy a certain quantity, absolutely. But what matters is what your competitors are going to do if you change your price, because this is eventually what is going to determine how much you sell. So you can have as much information as you want about the buyers themselves. If you don't have information about the behavior of your competitors if you change the price, Your individual demand curve is only an expectation or an assumption that you make. You may have information about the total market demand, yes, but you cannot have any information on the individual demand curve that you face if you do not know how your rivals will react to changes in your own price. We have to distinguish the market demand and the individual demand. What we have there in blue is the individual demand that each firm is expecting to face. Again, firms can have information about the total market demand, but if they want to be able to draw their individual demand curve, they need to have information about the response of their competitors to changes in prices. And this is not by doing market research that you can have this type of information. So trends in consumer buying will not help you to draw your individual demand curve. It will only help you to draw the market demand curve. Basically, your individual demand, let's call it DI, depends on your price, P1 or PA, because I am from A, but it also depends on PB, right? The price of my competitor. So even if I have information about the size of the market and all, if I cannot really predict what's going to be the relationship between PA and PB, because PB might itself depend on PA, right? If you change PA, if you cut the price, your competitor will change its own price. PB is a function of PA. So if you don't know this function, if you don't know what is the relationship between your price and the price of your rival, the price of your competitor, there is no way you can know the shape of the individual demand curve you are facing. So it applies to oligopolistic markets where each firm sells a differentiated product. Good question. That's a good question. I think it works in any type of oligopolistic market. It works for sure if you have a standardized product. It works for sure in a homogeneous oligopoly. I don't see why it would not work in a differentiated oligopoly. Yeah, there is no reason for which this model would not apply to the case of a differentiated oligopoly. I can't think of any reason for which this model would not be relevant in the case of product differentiation. Yeah. You might simply have a demand that is relatively less price elastic, since price differentiation reduces the intensity of competition and is likely to make your individual demand less price elastic. Yeah, but you might still have a kink. You might still have a sudden change in slope. So yeah, to me, it works in a differentiated oligopoly. Do you have any other questions about that? I hope you understand it better now. It really seems to be every time when I was teaching A2, I really felt like my students really struggled with this model. So I hope that after this webinar, I hope you have some tools now to teach this model in a clear way, and especially to teach your students how to effectively talk about this, to talk about this model in their essay questions. Again, they don't really have to draw the marginal revenue curve, like the green curve. They don't have to draw it. But what really matters is the shape of the demand curve. It's usually enough in A2. But this would be a more comprehensive representation, a more accurate representation that is especially useful to explain why, or to show, to prove why businesses don't have an incentive to change the price, why they would always lose profit if they attempted to raise or to cut the price. Do you have any other question? Okay. It's already been a long webinar tonight. It's time to get some rest. So let's stop here for today. The next webinar is not going to be tomorrow. It's not going to be on Wednesday. So it's probably going to be on Thursday. Will be about monopolistic competition, which will be the last market structure that we need to consider. And that is going to conclude this series of webinars on market structures. And then I think I'll do something about consumer equilibrium, budget lines in different curves, price effects, substitution effect, and also. Let's stop here for tonight. Thanks everyone for joining and talk to you very soon. Bye-bye.